An Exact Likeness by the Warp Storm Chronicler. The fortress estate of House Halford rose like a tombstone on a mountain of slag, its high ceramite walls clad in thick plates of adamantium armor and adorned with weapons emplacements every few yards. From his opulent office in the central Bastille, Governor Halford looked out through a massive arched window and down at the world that was in his charge. Rain, thick with pollutants, struck the glass and ran down the pane in thick, greasy streaks. In their wake, they left oily trails that shimmered with chemical hues that were almost pretty in the fragile daylight. The planet of Orios had no night and day cycle. Instead, an amber twilight never lifted over the industrial world on the Imperium's eastern fringe. The sunlight that reached the surface was choked by chemical clouds and oppressive ash storms that reduced the sky to a perpetual maroon haze. Towers and smokestacks stretched out as far as the eye could see, like great trees in a rock-crete forest. Each one was as large as a cathedral spire, and weeping yet more black smoke into the already polluted sky. Below them, in the massive sprawling factorum buildings, furnaces roared without rest, and the shrieking whine of ore haulers filled the air like the wails of tortured souls. Between the buildings and piles of discarded slag, he saw his heavily armed enforcers, wrapped in their grey and brown hooded ponchos, their only protection from the acid rains. He watched as they herded crowds of labourers dressed in rags of soiled yellows and oranges, as they were marched to and fro from their duties. He felt pleased by the strict regimented order he saw. Yes, this world was his, and he ruled it with an iron fist. But it had not always been so. He saw his own deformed reflection in the glass then, and he winced. Half his face was a melted ruin. One eyelid was fused shut, and his jaw had been warped into a permanent, jagged sneer. Much of his body below the stiff military uniform he wore was similarly scarred. All the result of the fire his rivals had caused in a failed attempt to assassinate him. On the breast of his uniform, he wore the sigils of all the other noble houses of Orios. They were a reminder, to himself and everyone else, of the price of rebellion. These sigils were all that remained of them. He had exterminated them all, every last one. Their bloodlines had been ended and their estates ground to rubble. Now only he remained, unchallenged, alone. And that was the problem that vexed him. He wasn't supposed to be alone. But the treasonous fire had robbed him of more than just his face. Abruptly he spun around. Before him, on his knees, cowered the painter. The man trembled in his chains, a cloth-draped canvas clutched tightly in both hands. His face was thin, lips blistered from chemical exposure, and his were eyes red and bloodshot from lack of sleep and overwork.
"I bring her likeness, my lord,"
he stammered, the chains around his neck rattling with each word.
I did all I could."
Halford's good eye narrowed.
"Unveil it to me."
The painter obeyed. The canvas showed a woman of noble bearing, dressed in pale silk, the colour of moonlight, her eyes soft, her smile uncertain. The brushwork was careful, reverent. It was not a poor painting. Many might even call it a masterpiece. But it wasn't her. It lacked that special something. He couldn't say what it was exactly. But he knew instinctively, deep in his soul, the likeness was devoid of her inner essence. Her ethereal beauty, that had soothed the rage within his heart, was gone from this world, and without it, his anger boiled to the surface, unchecked. He snatched the painting from the artist with a guttural snarl.
"You dare present me this crude imitation?"
Halford roared.
"This insult is what you dare bring before me."
"My lord,
The painter began, his eyes wide with fear.
"This is not her,"
Halford continued.
"This doesn't capture even a fraction of her likeness. She had fire, she had light. This thing has the eyes of a corpse and is devoid of soul.
But I followed your specifications.
Are you insinuating this is my fault? Were my instructions not clear? Did I not tell you the price of failure? How dare you?
Holding the painting in both hands, Halford began to beat its creator with it. Wood splintered and paint flaked as the piece broke apart after a fast flurry of blows.
I want my wife,
he hissed. His rage momentarily spent, he discarded what was left of the painting and motioned for the 2 guards near the door to retrieve the painter that had been beaten down to a sniveling prone position on the floor.
Cut off whichever hand he doesn't paint with and get him back to work with the others,
he instructed. The artist began to beg and plead as the guards dragged him away by his chains. But Halford ignored his cries as he turned to look out the window once more. His wife had died in the fire that had ravaged the old estate, and every painting and image of her had been consumed along with her. There wasn't a day that went by where he didn't feel her absence. He longed to see her one more time. So what was a man with absolute power to do in such a situation? To Halford, an obvious solution was clear. He had press-ganged every artisan he could find to labor within the deepest halls of his fortress. Their task was to recreate her likeness. But even with the correct motivation, they had failed him time and time again. Yet, Halford would not be denied. No matter what it took, no matter if they said what he wanted was impossible. Penelope would never have agreed to marry him if he were the kind of man that took no for an answer. That had taken some strong arming too, but sooner or later Halford always got his way. It was simple, really. Eventually, one of the artists would capture the essence of his love. Or they would all be worked to death, and he would just replace them with more, to toil in their place. 2 hours later, unbid, the guards returned. Between them walked another man Halford didn't recognize. He sized him up. The stranger was tall, very thin, and not muscular at all. He wore a long green hooded robe. Its surface had a wet and waxy sheen, and from its sleeves peeked 2 pale, bony hands. He didn't seem to pose a threat.
Who is this?
Halford asked, voice low.
He's a volunteer, my lord, answering your decree. He claims to be a sculptor.
One of the guards said before opening and placing a canvas bag on the floor. Halford approached and peered inside. In the bag, he saw what looked to be a sculptor's tools, hammers of various sizes, chisels and files. But for those trained in the arts of death, they could just as easily be the implements of an assassin as much as an artisan.
Identify yourself,
Halford snapped. The shriveled hands reached up to draw back the hood to reveal an equally gaunt and aged face. Dull grey eyes were set into deep, darkened sockets, on a face that appeared to be stretched too tightly over a skull that was practically visible through the thin parchment-like skin. The remaining few strands of hair he still had was long and messy and stuck to his damp, pallid skin.
My Lord Governor Halford,
He began.
I am Ramsley von Morgian, Artisan Supreme.
Artisan Supreme. A lofty title. Bestowed upon you by whom?
Halford asked, unconvinced.
By my patron, of course, but they have given me special dispensation to answer your summons.
Ramsley said, and pointed towards his bag with a long, bony twig-like finger. From the bag, Halford pulled out a folded piece of paper. He opened it to reveal a recruitment invitation for artisans to come to the Halford estate to earn a great reward. Halford had commissioned 1 million of them to be distributed all over the world a few years ago. That had been before he had decided it would be a whole lot more efficient to send out his soldiers to recruit them by force instead.
I see. You came because of this?
Halford asked, holding up the paper.
Indeed, Lord Governor.
Ramsley replied.
Should you succeed, I shall shower you in thrones, such that you shall never want until the end of your days. But should you fail to deliver, know this, you shall never leave.
I understand. Satisfaction is guaranteed.
Ramsay said with a grin, revealing a mouth of blackened, broken teeth.
It is guaranteed with your life. You are aware of the Chamber Rebellion and the failed assassination attempt that cost me my beloved wife.
Yes, my Lord Governor?
You will create for me a likeness of my beloved bride. You shall breathe such passion, such life into the piece, that when I look upon it, I shall feel as though she has returned to me.
Supply me with all that I need, and it shall be as you so desire.
You will be afforded all the materials you request. Her details and exact measurements shall be explained to you.
Halford said before turning to the two guards.
Take him to the lower halls and have him put to work with the others.
At his orders, the guards jumped into action, locking manacles to Ramsley's feet and retrieving his bag. He didn't resist and seemed quite pleased with himself as he was led away and out of the office. How strange, Halford thought as the spindly old man shuffled into the corridor. It had been so long since someone had volunteered for the commission. Slowly, Halford turned around and returned to his solo vigil at the window, looking out at the barren expanse of his domain. The sounds of chisels scraping stone echoed off the walls as Governor Halford walked the length of the high gantry above the cavernous artisan hall deep in the bowels of his fortress estate. The vast chamber was lit by 100 flickering candles that filled the expanse with a gentle smoky fog and an oppressive waxy smell that stuck to the back of the throat. Below him, rows of chained artisans hunched over sculpting benches and painters' easels. Visibility was poor in the dim light the candles cast, but bothered Halford not at all. He was content to see the various artists squinting and peering at their commissions. As far as he was concerned, it allowed them to put all their attention on creating their pieces. Any lasting damage to their eyesight, or any other ill effects of their toil beyond creating the likeness of his beloved, was not his concern. As he walked, Halford passed servo skulls that silently hovered and bobbed through the air, scanning the artists' exhausted faces, searching for signs of idleness. Halford paused, resting a gloved hand on the rusting rail. He looked down and watched a woman as she hammered a chisel with trembling hands, her blistered fingers bleeding onto the stone. The chisel slipped from her grasp to hit the floor with a loud clatter. The noise attracted the servo skulls that swarmed around her, singling her out to be punished by the enforcers that patrolled the hall. But Halford didn't notice the commotion. His mind was elsewhere. The gaunt sculptor had not left his thoughts since their first meeting. Ramsley von Morgian. There had been something familiar about him, something he couldn't quite place, and like a melody he couldn't get out of his head, it taunted him. And unlike the others that had been brought kicking and screaming to the lower hall, he had volunteered. Perhaps he was ignorant of the situation, or just supremely confident in his abilities. Either way, he lacked the look of fear and desperation Halford had come to expect from those that took up the commission. By the time he reached his office, Halford had decided to check on his progress and had the sculptor brought to him with his sculpture for inspection. The fine chamber doors to his office swung open and 2 guards marched in. Between them, heavy chains attached to his ankles, clanking as he moved, waddled Ramsley. His gaunt, withered frame was such that it was hard to say if his time in the hall had affected his health in any way. He looked much the same as before, like an animated corpse that hadn't realized it was dead, and so continued on about its day. Regardless, that meant nothing to Halford, who cared not about his welfare. Instead, he eyed what followed behind them. Transported on a wheeled platform was a veiled statue. Halford straightened in his seat, eagerly leaning forward. The cloth that covered the piece was thick, but he could already make out the contours beneath, the curve of a hip, the slope of shoulders. His heartbeat quickened and he gestured with one hand.
Show me.
A guard pulled at the cloth and it dropped away. And there she was. Penelope. Fashioned from perfectly polished white marble was a statue of her likeness in every detail. Her height, features, and even her posture and pose was as Halford remembered. But it felt flat somehow. It stirred nothing in his heart, not like she had. It was just another work of art of a beautiful girl fashioned in stone, as had been made so many times before, throughout human history, on the countless multitude of worlds that made up the Imperium. It lacked her uniqueness, that special something that made Penelope special. No matter how skillfully it was wrought or perfect the proportions were, it still wasn't her. It was a beautiful mockery, but a mockery all the same, and that enraged him. Halford's face twisted with sudden fury. He bellowed wordlessly and began hurling books from a nearby shelf. A candelabra crashed against the wall. With a swipe across his desk, a glass of recaf was sent flying and shattered on the floor, soaking the exquisite red carpet with a growing brown stain. The guards flinched but did not move, as more objects were hurled around the room. Halford grabbed a heavy wrought candlestick and approached the statue with murder in his eyes.
Throne be cursed,
He growled, voice raw with grief.
You dare stand here in her place.
He raised the weapon, but then he stopped, frozen in place. With the blunt object held above his head, ready to bring it down, to strike the marble Penelope before him, he paused. The situation felt so familiar. For the briefest of moments, he could have sworn he saw fear in the statue's white marble eyes. He saw her. Then the moment passed, and it slipped away. Halford released his murderous grip on the candlestick, and it dropped to the floor behind him with a dull thud. His hands trembled. From where he stood by the doorway, flanked by the two guards, Ramsley spoke. His voice was dry and cold, like wind through a crypt.
It's not yet finished, my lord. This is but the first phase of the final piece you desire.
Halford turned, slow and wide-eyed.
It shows promise. You can improve it?
Ramsley nodded once.
To bring her true likeness into being, I require more unconventional resources.
Anything.
Halford said, breath quickening.
Whatever you need, you shall have it.
The sculptor tilted his head, the aged bones in his neck cracking audibly.
I require skin.
The room went still. Halford blinked.
Skin?
Yes, Lord Governor. Real, living, human skin. Marble lacks warmth. It is cold and unforgiving. She was neither. You demand authenticity, and imitation will not satisfy your lofty expectations. I must bind the sculpture in life, wrap her in a final layer, so that a true likeness can stand before you once more.
Halford hesitated.
That is an unusual request.
I suppose so, Lord Governor. But in art, boundaries must be pushed. How else can the unattainable become the attainable?
Halford mulled it over for less than a second. What did he care as long as he got what he wanted?
So be it. Select some of the failed artisans, and I'll have them flayed to your specifications.
Apologies, Lord Governor, but that simply will not do.
Ramsley said in a matter-of-fact tone.
I fear adult flesh is no good. Scarred, weathered, old. An inferior product would result in an inferior final piece. But the skin of children is another matter. Youthful and without blemish.
Halford thought it over.
She was perfection. Delicate, with a soft skin that bruised easily. You shall be supplied with what you wish.
The two guards stiffened. One dropped his gaze to the floor as the other ground his teeth, the muscle in his jaw twitching. Neither spoke. As distasteful as it was an order from the governor himself and could not be refused.
Preferably girls. Unmarked, of course. Perhaps 6 or so will suffice, depending on their size.
Ramsley said, rubbing his chin in contemplation. Halford's gaze returned to the statue. 12 girls. It was inconsequential, really, as long as he got what he wanted.
See that he has what he needs.
Halford instructed without emotion, and then dismissed them all with a wave of his hand. As the statue was wheeled away, he caressed its face with a gloved hand.
Soon, my love,
he whispered, voice trembling.
I'll see you again.
As he was marched in chains, back to the darkness of the lower hall, Ramsley smiled. For days, Governor Halford couldn't sleep, his nerves raw with anticipation. So he took to wandering the black rockcrete halls of his fortress estate like a spectre each evening. A master known for his violent outbursts, his servants scattered at his approach or fell prostrate to their knees. But Halford didn't notice them as he marched past. He was lost in his memories of Penelope and all that he had done to win her hand in marriage. It was a cruel twist of fate that she was taken from him. But he hoped Ramsley could return a piece of her to him, so that in some way he would see her again. She was his heart's desire, his greatest prize. He tried to be patient, but of all the characteristics he did possess, patience was not one of them. So on the 4th day, he demanded Ramsley finish his work and bring Penelope to him. He was sat, slumped at his desk, when the heavy doors of his inner sanctum groaned open. He looked up. He had thick black circles under his red eyes, with rough stubble peppering the unscarred half of his face. 4 guards entered in silence, surrounding a familiar veiled statue, wheeled in upon its platform. Behind it, still in shackles, walked Ramsley, his skeletal frame hunched but composed with a razor-thin smile etched upon his gaunt face.
My Lord Governor,
he intoned, bowing his head. Halford rose slowly from his chair. At first he said nothing. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. And now the time was finally here. The anticipation and anxiety was almost too much. What if it was another failure? A flash of despair rushed through him, and his throat went dry, before it was replaced by a cold anger. If he was left wanting, Ramsley would pay the price, and he would suffer the full extent of his wrath. Halford's whole world seemed to narrow to a single point, centered on the thin fabric that obscured the statue.
Show her to me,
he hissed. The veil was drawn back, and as it struck the floor, for Governor Halford, time stopped. There she stood, just like she had never been taken from him. His Penelope. She wore a flowing white gown of whisper-thin silk, as she had on their wedding night, perfectly recreated. Her lips were parted slightly, as if caught mid-breath, mid-sigh, and her eyes, so lifelike, seemed to look right at him. Halford stumbled forward, his heart racing in his chest. It was just like her. No, it was her.
My love,
he breathed. Halford's hand actually shook as he reached toward the statue. He paused an inch away, hesitating to touch her in case doing so would dispel the almost magical apparition that had him enthralled. Then, taking a breath, he gently cupped her cheek in his gloved hand.
She is everything you asked for?
Ramsley said quietly, breaking the silence. Halford looked over at him as if in a daze.
You've done it. You've really done it.
It is as I told you, Lord Governor. Satisfaction was guaranteed. I endeavored to encapsulate her, body and soul.
Ramsley explained.
But all things have a cost. And now, my payment?
Yes, of course. Your commission is complete and you shall be compensated. Your weight in thrones.
Halford nodded before turning to the head guard.
Release him and see to it. and dismiss the other artisans. Their services are no longer required.
A guard stepped forward and knelt down and removed Ramsley's shackles. Ramsley dipped his head, offering a slight bow.
Thank you, Lord Governor. Then I shall take my leave.
Yes, yes.
Halford said dismissively.
Now all of you be gone. Leave us.
The guards exchanged anxious glances, but obeyed. They filed out of the room, closing the chamber doors behind them and leaving Halford alone with the statue of his beloved. He circled the statue slowly, drinking it in as he admired it from every angle. The resemblance was unbelievable, uncanny, like she really was in the room with him once more. Curiously, wherever he moved in the room, the eyes seemed to always be looking in his direction. Some secret optical trick of the master sculptor's craft, no doubt, Halford thought. Halford stepped closer and slipped his arms around the waist. He braced himself for the chill of cold stone through fabric, but instead felt a radiant, lifelike warmth. His breath caught. He tightened his embrace, pulling himself into her. It even smelled like Penelope. A low, trembling laugh escaped Halford's twisted lips. He was impressed, truly. Slowly he began to sway, just as they had in the grand ballroom on their wedding night. But this time, there was no music, except for the steady beat of his heart.
I missed you,
he whispered, tears spilling down his unscarred cheek. He imagined the statue's arms moving to wrap around him as he held it close.
How could you leave me?
Halford asked, looking into the eyes he remembered so well.
Did you know what your loss cost me? What I had to do? But it's all right. You're here now. I forgive you.
Before he even realized they were there, the statue's hands around his neck began to tighten. He began to thrash around in an attempt to free himself. But no matter how hard Halford yanked at the stiff stone fingers, they wouldn't budge. In desperation, he began to punch and kick at the statue, and in his mind he saw a brief flashback of how he would do the same to Penelope whenever she dared to disobey him. The room seemed to darken, and stars popped at the edge of his vision as his strength left him, and his arms flopped down limply at his sides. As his life slipped away, he looked into the perfect likeness of Penelope's eyes, and in them he saw reflected a truth he had refused to accept, but long suspected. There never was an assassination attempt by rival houses. Forced into a marriage against her will, to an abusive man, violent and obsessed with her perfection, she had chosen to end it all. It was her that had set the fire, in an attempt to put a stop to her misery and the life of her tormentor. As everything in his field of view became a foggy haze, he saw a vision. He saw Penelope bloodied and weeping after a beating. He saw as she poured lamp oil across the drapes, through the corridors and around the bed. How, with a single strike of a match, she'd lit the fire, and watched, as flames roared around her, how she'd actually smiled. It had all been her doing. The statue had indeed captured Penelope's essence, mainly her resolve to no longer be an object of his infatuation or his lustful abuse. With his last desperate breath, Halford let out a strangled gargle for help. And then, the life of cruelty and violence was crushed out of him.